Every time the first cold snap hits, we barely think about it. Tap a screen and our house is warm. High-tech parkas, triple-pane windows, all this gear insulates us from the cold. But I always ask myself, what happens when that breaks or the power grid goes down? I started digging into how people survived before all this existed, and I found something fascinating. For centuries, people thrived during brutal winters, like the Little Ice Age, using a resource we almost completely ignore today, animal fat. I know it sounds too simple, maybe even gross, but medieval peasants faced the same problems as a prepper's worst-case scenario. Drafty homes losing heat, staying dry in snow, getting enough calories to stay warm. In this video, we're investigating 8 of these systems. It might change how you think about being prepared. But before we dive in, I'm curious. Have you ever used animal fat for anything practical? Cooking, making candles, waterproofing leather? Drop a comment below and let me know. I read every single one, and your experiences always teach me something new. System 1. The high-calorie furnace. Let's start with the most critical thing, generating body heat. In a world without central heating, your own body is the primary furnace. The modern solution is to just turn up the dial. Their solution was to fuel the fire from within. The principle is brilliant. It's called diet-induced thermogenesis. When you eat, your body burns energy to digest the food, and that process generates heat. Fats are the most calorie-dense food you can get, 9 calories per gram compared to 4 for carbohydrates or protein. So a diet that strategically includes fat gives your body a massive amount of fuel to burn, raising your core temperature from the inside out. Medieval peasants knew this from hard-won experience. While most of their diet was grains, things like barley, oats, and rye, fat was a critical supplement, especially for anyone doing hard physical labor out in the freezing cold. Historical records show us that peasant men needed around 2,900 calories per day, but those engaged in particularly heavy labor, such as loggers or stoneworkers, could consume 3,500 calories or more. That's rivaling today's professional athletes. The key event was the autumn slaughter, what historians call the Martinmas slaughter, around November 11th. It was impossible to feed all your livestock through the winter when forage was scarce and expensive, so animals, especially pigs, were butchered. This provided a massive influx of meat and, crucially, fat. This fat was rendered into lard and wasn't just for cooking. They used a technique called potting. Meat would be cooked, packed into earthenware pots, and then completely sealed with a thick layer of melted lard. This created an airtight barrier, preserving the calorie-dense meat for months without refrigeration. Imagine a perpetual stew simmering over the fire for weeks. Into it goes whatever you have, root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, grains, and a generous scoop of that preserved fatty meat. Every spoonful was another log on the internal fire, literally warming you from the inside. This wasn't gluttony or indulgence. It was a calculated survival strategy, turning their own bodies into the main source of warmth. When you understand that a single gram of fat provides more than twice the energy of protein or carbs, you realize these people weren't primitive. They were running a highly optimized biological heating system. System 2. The tallow lamp. A personal sun. Picture this. It's the dead of winter and the sun sets at 4 p.m. You're facing 16 hours of darkness in a small drafty hut. The battle against the cold becomes a battle against the dark. For a peasant family, light was more than a convenience. It was safety, comfort, and psychological survival. And again, the solution was animal fat. The primary light source for the common person wasn't the clean-burning beeswax candles of the rich. Those were expensive and reserved for churches and nobility. It was the tallow candle or the even simpler rushlight. Tallow is the hard fat rendered from cattle or sheep, specifically from around the kidneys and organs. To make candles, they'd melt the tallow and repeatedly dip a wick, usually made from twisted hemp or flax, into it, letting each layer cool and build up. Each dipping added thickness until you had a functional candle. For the poorest households, there was the rushlight. They'd gather rushes from nearby wetlands, peel them carefully to expose the soft pith inside, and soak them in melted fat. The saturated rush was both the fuel and the wick. You'd place it at an angle in a simple metal holder, light the end, and it would burn slowly, giving off a small but steady flame. But here's the forgotten genius. These weren't just lights. They were miniature heat sources. Now don't misunderstand me. A single tallow candle isn't going to heat a room, but think of it as a tiny personal fireplace. The radiant heat from a candle flame held close is just enough to warm your frozen fingers while you're mending clothes or fixing a tool after dark. In a space where the only other heat is a central fire pit that's constantly battling drafts, these small portable flames were vital satellites of warmth scattered around the living space. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Tallow candles were notoriously smelly, giving off an odor of cooked meat and smoke, and they produced a lot of soot that would coat walls and lungs alike. But the trade-off was worth it. That small flame was a psychological anchor in the oppressive dark, a tiny sun fighting back the night and providing just enough heat to make life bearable after sunset. Modern preppers spend hundreds on LED lanterns and batteries. Medieval peasants had a renewable light and heat source that cost them nothing but time, and the byproduct of an animal they'd already butchered for food. System 3. The grease shield. In any long-term survival situation, you learn a hard truth fast. Being wet is often more dangerous than being cold. Damp clothes suck heat from your body at an alarming rate, up to 25 times faster than dry clothes. Your core temperature can drop into hypothermia range in minutes, not hours. The medieval peasant understood this intimately. Their solution was to create a personal, wearable shield against moisture. The most common and critical use was on their footwear. Peasant shoes were simple leather, often just a single piece of cowhide shaped and stitched, called turn shoes. These soaked through quickly in wet snow or when trudging through muddy fields. To fight this, they used a technique we'd recognize today as Dubbin. The word comes from dubbing, the act of dressing leather. They'd take rendered animal fat, sometimes mixed with beeswax if they could afford it, and rub it deep into the leather, often warming both the fat and the boots by the fire to help the grease penetrate the fibers. The fat saturated the material at a molecular level, filling the tiny spaces between the leather fibers and making it water repellent. Historical recipes from the 1600s describe mixing mutton tallow with pine rosin in specific ratios for maximum waterproofing. Was it perfect? No. It was sticky, it attracted dirt and debris, and it had to be reapplied regularly, especially after heavy use. But it kept their feet dry, and in a world where frostbite could mean losing toes, a foot, or your life from infection, this was critical survival technology. While we don't have extensive written documentation, it's highly likely they extended this logic to their own skin. Without modern lotions, a thin layer of lard rubbed onto your hands and face would serve as a crude but effective barrier against windburn and chapping during long hours of outdoor work in sub-zero temperatures. Think of it as a medieval barrier cream. The fat created a protective layer that locked in your skin's natural moisture and shielded you from the drying effects of winter wind. This system highlights a core principle of survival: pragmatism over comfort. Was it pleasant to wear greased-up boots or have a film of lard on your face? Probably not by our standards. But it worked. Staying dry was half the battle against winter, and animal fat was the ammunition. If you're getting value from this deep dive into forgotten survival wisdom, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps more people discover these techniques that could save their lives one day. Thank you. System 4. The Fat Medicine Cabinet. Beyond just surviving the cold, animal fat served another crucial role. It was their pharmacy. Medieval healers understood something that modern medicine is only now rediscovering through scientific research. Fat is one of the most effective delivery systems for medicine. The reason is biochemistry. Many healing compounds found in plants are fat-soluble, not water-soluble. That means they need a fatty base to be absorbed effectively through the skin. Medieval healers, working through trial and error over generations, figured this out empirically. They'd take rendered lard or tallow and infuse it with healing herbs: comfrey for wounds and broken bones, chamomile for inflammation, calendula for infections and skin conditions. The process was simple but required knowledge. Heat the fat gently, add dried or fresh herbs, let it steep for hours, then strain out the plant material. What remained was a medicated salve. These weren't just folk remedies with placebo effects. Modern analysis of traditional fat-based salves shows they were genuinely effective. The fat base served multiple functions. It acted as a carrier, allowing the medicinal compounds to penetrate deep into tissue. It created a protective barrier over wounds, keeping out dirt and bacteria while locking in moisture that promoted healing. And the fat itself had anti-inflammatory properties. If you cut your hand splitting wood in sub-zero temperatures, the risk wasn't just the wound. It was infection in an era before antibiotics. It was the wound not healing because cold restricts blood flow to extremities. A thick application of herbal tallow salve could mean the difference between healing cleanly in 2 weeks and losing fingers to gangrene. The sophisticated part. They had different fat bases for different purposes. Lard from pigs was softer and absorbed quickly, good for facial applications. Beef tallow was harder and created a more durable barrier, better for hands and feet that needed protection during work. Goose fat was prized for respiratory issues, rubbed on the chest to ease breathing. This was pharmaceutical technology, using the resources at hand. No patents, no prescriptions, just accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of survival. System 5. The Soap Revolution. Here's something that might surprise you, especially if you've seen medieval peasants portrayed in movies. They weren't as filthy as Hollywood wants you to believe. And animal fat was their secret weapon for staying clean, which in turn was critical for preventing disease and infection during brutal winters when your immune system was already stressed. They discovered, probably by accident initially, that mixing rendered tallow with lye created from wood ash produced something remarkable: soap. The chemistry is called saponification. When fat molecules react with the alkaline lye, they break down and reform into soap molecules, which have the unique ability to bind to both water and oils, allowing you to rinse away dirt and grease. The process was labor-intensive and required real skill. You'd collect wood ashes from your fire over weeks. The best came from hardwoods like oak or beech. These ashes were placed in a barrel or wooden hopper lined with straw as a filter. Boiling water was poured through the ashes, and as it dripped through, it leached out potassium hydroxide, creating lye. The strength of this lye was tested by floating an egg in it. If the egg floated with about the size of a small coin visible above the surface, the lye was ready. Too strong, and it would burn your skin. Too weak, and it wouldn't make soap. This lye was then combined with melted tallow in large pots and boiled for 6 to 8 hours, constantly stirred. You'd know the soap was ready when it became thick and formed long bubbles when simmering. They'd test samples on small plates, cutting them with sticks. If the cut sealed back together, the soap had saponified properly. The result was a dark, soft soap called black soap because of the color from the wood ash. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't scented with lavender like modern soap, but it worked. It could tackle everything from greasy wool that needed cleaning before weaving to washing bodies and preventing the buildup of grime that could lead to skin infections. In a time when staying clean wasn't just about social acceptability, but about preventing disease, this tallow-based soap was a survival tool disguised as a hygiene product. The wealthier classes had access to white soap made with better ingredients, but even the poorest peasant could make functional soap from materials they already had. Think about the ingenuity here. They took 2 waste products, ash from fires they'd burn anyway, and fat from butchered animals, and through knowledge of chemistry they didn't have words for yet, they created a cleaning agent that kept them healthy through winter's worst. System 6. Sealing the shelter. A peasant's wattle and daub hut was a constant battle against drafts. The structure was simple: a wooden frame filled with woven branches, wattle, and plastered with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw, the daub. Every crack, every gap was a place for precious heat to escape and bitter cold to invade. So their survival system extended from protecting their bodies to fortifying their homes. Now their primary insulation wasn't fat itself, but other animal byproducts. After the autumn slaughter, animal hides that weren't turned into leather for clothes or shoes were stretched and used as heavy curtains. These were hung over drafty doorways or the small window openings, acting like thick, wind-blocking barriers. A well-placed hide curtain could reduce heat loss through a doorway by more than half. But the fat still played a clever and practical role. The daub plaster, that mixture of clay and straw, would crack as it dried out and weathered through seasonal changes. These cracks were more than cosmetic problems. They were thermal leaks. While we don't have extensive written documentation, it's highly plausible, based on what we know of their resourcefulness, that peasants created a primitive caulk by working animal fat into soft clay or mixing it with ash to create a pliable paste. The fat would have served multiple functions in this mixture. Its sticky, adhesive quality would help it cling to the cracks. Its water-resistant properties would prevent moisture from seeping through and causing more damage. And as it hardened, it would create a flexible seal that could withstand some expansion and contraction from temperature changes. Archaeological evidence from preserved medieval structures shows repairs in daub that have unusual compositions, suggesting various experimental mixtures. The principle makes perfect sense. If fat waterproofs leather and preserves food, why wouldn't you use it to seal your home? It was this waste not, want not philosophy that defined their existence. The bloody, messy process of butchering an animal, something that happened once or twice a year, was transformed into a cascade of life-saving resources that lasted months. The fat, which we might see today as a greasy byproduct to be discarded, was elevated to a critical multi-purpose tool. It was food. It was fuel for light. It was waterproofing for boots and possibly skin. It was medicine. It was soap. And it was a component of shelter maintenance. Every part of the animal was used. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant death. System 7. The ultimate preservation technology. Remember that autumn slaughter I mentioned? The fat from those animals became something even more impressive than just cooking fuel or candle material. It became essentially a time machine for food preservation. By mixing dried, thoroughly pounded meat with rendered fat in a careful ratio, approximately 1:1 by weight, medieval and early modern people in various cultures created what military researchers would later call the ultimate survival food. The fat served as a complete barrier against oxygen and moisture, the two things that cause food to spoil. The process required precision. First, meat was cut into thin strips and dried until completely brittle, either in the sun, over a slow fire, or in the cold, dry air of winter itself. This removed virtually all moisture. The dried meat was then pounded, sometimes for hours, until it became almost powder-like in consistency. This increased the surface area, allowing the fat to coat every particle. Melted tallow was then mixed in while still warm, but not hot enough to cook the meat further. The ratio was critical. Too little fat and air pockets remained where bacteria could grow. Too much fat, and the mixture became too soft and rancid fats could separate. When done correctly and packed into sealed containers, this fat-preserved meat could remain edible for years, even decades. Modern military studies conducted in the 1960s found that people could survive for extended periods on surprisingly small amounts of this fat-meat combination, around 1,000 calories worth during starvation conditions. The fat provided concentrated energy, while the protein maintained muscle mass. During the hardest months of winter, from January through March, when stored vegetables were running low and no fresh food was available, this fat-preserved meat was often the difference between starvation and survival. A family might have 50 or more pounds of this mixture stored away, representing thousands of calories that wouldn't spoil no matter how long or cold the winter became. Think about what this represents. Without electricity, without canning, without freeze-drying, they had a shelf-stable protein source that could outlast any modern MRE. And the key ingredient was the one thing we throw away: pure animal fat. System 8. The tool protector. In medieval winter, your tools were your lifeline. There were no hardware stores, no Amazon deliveries, no way to quickly replace a broken or damaged tool. A broken axe meant you couldn't split firewood, which meant you couldn't heat your home. A rusted plough meant you couldn't prepare fields in spring, which meant no crops, which meant starvation. Tool maintenance wasn't a hobby, it was life or death serious. And once again, animal fat provided the solution. They'd coat their metal tools, axes, saws, knives, farm implements, with a thin layer of tallow. This wasn't a casual wipe down, it was a deliberate preservation technique. The process was simple. After using a tool, especially if it had gotten wet, they'd warm it slightly by the fire to drive off any moisture. Then they'd rub tallow over every metal surface, working it into any joints or moving parts. The fat created a hydrophobic barrier, a protective shield against moisture and oxygen, the two elements that cause rust. In the humid, wet conditions of a medieval dwelling, where water vapor from cooking, breathing, and damp clothes constantly filled the air, unprotected metal would rust within days. But there's more. In freezing conditions, metal becomes brittle. It can crack or shatter under stress. The thin film of fat coating the metal provided a tiny amount of insulation and, more importantly, reduced the direct impact of extreme temperature changes. A tool stored near the fire wouldn't experience quite as violent a thermal shock when taken outside into -20 degrees Fahrenheit air if it had a protective fat layer. Historical records also show that tallow was used for lubricating moving parts, anything with a hinge, a slide, or metal-on-metal contact. The fat reduced friction and wear, extending the tool's working life by years. Some craftsmen took this further, mixing tallow with other substances. Blacksmiths would create special protective compounds by melting tallow with beeswax for a harder finish, or mixing it with fine ash to create a mildly abrasive paste for cleaning before applying a pure fat layer. The sophistication here is easy to miss. They were practicing preventive maintenance, using material science principles they couldn't articulate but understood through generational experience. That thin film of animal fat represented the difference between having functional tools and facing winter helpless. So there you have it, 8 interconnected systems that reveal how medieval peasants transformed animal fat, something we literally throw away, into a complete survival infrastructure covering heating, lighting, waterproofing, medicine, hygiene, food preservation, and tool maintenance. This wasn't primitive desperation. This was sophisticated systems thinking refined over generations, proving that nature provides everything we need if we're clever enough to recognize it. Today, we've traded this resilience for fragile convenience, becoming dependent on supply chains and electricity for survival. But here's my challenge to you. Go to your local butcher this week, get some beef fat trimmings for free or nearly free, render a small batch, and make just one tallow candle. Light it on a dark evening, feel the heat it gives off, and you'll understand in that moment what medieval peasants knew instinctively, that forgotten wisdom isn't just historical trivia, it's life-saving knowledge we abandoned too soon. Which of these 8 systems surprised you most, and are you actually going to try this? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one where we continue uncovering the forgotten wisdom of the past. Wisdom of the past. Wisdom of